Hello, everyone. Welcome back. If you can believe it, we're on our last session. So I'd like to welcome everyone back. And our last panel, we have moderated by Adam Peltz, Director and Senior Attorney of Energy Transition for the Environmental Defense Fund, and IOGCC ERRT Chair. Adam, welcome.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. And thanks so much for not just joining us today, but sticking around into hour 4 of this excellent information-packed session that's giving all of us, I think, a lot to think about on this subject. So my hope with this final session is to explore some of the big picture questions around the role of carbon finance in oil and gas well closure. The issue is of significant interest to me as I think about how are we going to handle the hundreds of billions of dollars of legacy oil and gas asset closure costs that we face globally over the coming decades. How much of this funding will come from industry itself, how much from public sources, and how much potentially from carbon finance, and what problems might be left over even with all of that. And if carbon finance is part of the equation here, how do we make sure that it is deployed properly and fairly? And so with that, I want to introduce our panel today. We have Caitlin Sparks, the CEO of Onyx Transition, David Daniels, the senior researcher at the Swedish National Road and Transportation Research Institute, and non-resident fellow at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Maris Densmore, the Director of Industrial Solutions at ACR. And Virginia Palacios, who you just saw, the Executive Director at Commission Shift. And to kick us off, I want to start by asking each panelist, as they briefly introduce themselves, what is important to them about this topic? And what is your take on the role of carbon finance in solving this problem? We may as well go in alphabetical order. Let's start with Caitlin.
I think Caitlin is having some connectivity issues. So if we could move on, and then when Caitlin gets back, I'll let you know.
Great. Well, marching along the alphabet, David.
Sounds good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I always have to do the handshake. I think this is a great topic, and I'm really, I want to congratulate AAAS for hosting this symposium, and I'm very grateful to them. I think I've learned a lot actually in the previous sessions, and it's clearly a very important topic. The topic of emissions from upstream oil and gas production is a problem which is related to the overall problem of combating global climate change, but it's almost a separate, independent issue. It's unrelated to the transition of somewhat unrelated to the transition of the energy and transport sector, which is what my research is in Sweden, is looking at the transition of the energy and transport sector. But the upstream emissions from oil and gas is one of these things where we can transform the transport sector and the energy sector. But if we don't address the upstream emissions from legacy oil and gas wells, then we're not going to get to where we want to go. And conversely, if we can address this, we don't need to necessarily. We can address this without having to also address, in the meantime, while we're addressing the transition of the energy system writ large. So I think it's an interesting test case to test different types of policies, and voluntary carbon markets is a policy-like instrument that I think is really interesting.
Great. Thanks, David. We'll keep going in alphabetical order, and we'll circle back around. So Maris?
Hi, Adam. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. And as Adam said, thank you for sticking around. I'm Maris Densmore. I'm the Director of Industrial and Engineered Solutions at ACR. We are a global carbon crediting program, but I'm really a geologist. And I came into this specific role about 2.5 years ago from a background of environment and energy policy, geotechnical, field operations, so lots of stuff. And I really like wading into these tough questions around climate, environment, energy, and how that interacts with the community and social realities of all these issues. And I'm interested in this discussion specifically, and this whole 4 hours of interesting stuff, because ACER is really focused on non-CO2 gases, and that includes methane, of course, and other short-lived climate pollutants, because they're absolutely going to crush the atmosphere over the next few decades. And so with that, it's all time sensitive for the atmosphere, and we need to get on this and do this very quickly. And the International Energy Agency says that about 30% of the warming to date is due to methane. And so tackling methane and these other short-lived climate pollutants is really key to preventing a huge amount of warming in the very short term. And so there's millions of wells we've talked about throughout the day so far that have different names and different labels, and sometimes those labels vary from place to place, and they need plugging, and some of them need them immediately, and some of them need them immediately for different reasons, for community reasons or environmental reasons. And our methodology is really focused on a subset of those wells, and that's leaking orphaned wells, because we saw that as the best path to leverage carbon finance and really lean into the additionality of when you have a well that doesn't have anybody that's really ultimately responsible for it. And these wells were sort of languishing, and the research has shown that it's a problem of numbers, and not necessarily one big well, but several big wells and some smaller wells. And so really giving that metric to the industry as a way to see success. I think Virginia said in her previous comments, you know, Texas is plugging the shallow wells because they can say we plug this many wells, but we really want to say we prevented this amount of methane, and we're really focused on that 1 ton of methane. So that's why I'm excited. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Maris. Virginia, I know you just kind of said your piece, but now we're in a slightly different room. So say it again with a different perspective.
I will. Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier for me to imagine that we can persuade the Texas legislature and railroad commissioners to protect groundwater than to stop greenhouse gas emissions. It's also easier for me to believe that it's a persuasive argument that they are protecting private property rights when they do that. And, you know, I think the long term is really important. I think that those arguments that I just outlined are going to get us a shorter term result than the voluntary carbon market will, which, you know, I just think there's going to be a lot of, you know, slippage or leakage in the voluntary carbon market until the carbon market more broadly is like expansive and everybody's participating. But again, I'm not sure that an expansive carbon market really is the end goal. I think what we need to deal with this problem of unplugged wells is stronger regulation. And we need the companies to internalize their cost of doing business. You know, they put this into all of their minerals leases that they're going to go and plug these wells at the end of the day. And both the Railroad Commission and bankruptcy court judges are letting them off the hook. Why is that?
Great, thank you, Virginia. That was different from before. Okay, Caitlin, please share your thoughts.
Hi, guys. I am Caitlin Sparks. I am the CEO of Onyx Transition. I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you for the opportunity to have a dialogue. I was able to catch a little bit of the prior sessions and wanted to say thank you to folks who are advocating for increased rigor and transparency in this space and have been doing so for a lifetime. I am one of them. I got my start in this space almost 2 decades ago, helping to start something called the Gold Standard, a certification standard for carbon offsets. And I never expected to return to the thorny, complicated, uncertain world of carbon crediting, but for the urgency of the moment we are now in. But for a recognition that I myself had to come to, which is that regulation and policy, while critically important to continue to advance, just have simply failed to do the job. Emissions continue to go up. So what Onyx has done is create a new type of credit for both voluntary and compliance applications that helps on the topic of transition, speed the transition by providing an incentive for the early decommissioning of highly emissive fossil fuel assets at least 10 to 15 years before their planned end of life, and then drives the proceeds into transition critical, carbon negative, climate positive investment opportunities. We are big believers in transparency and rigor across the board. But we also believe that given the moment that we are in, it is important to grab all levers and make the most of them. And we call our platform one that is designed for the speed, scale, and impact that the climate crisis requires. So happy to talk about it in more detail.
Great. Well, thank you, Caitlin, and thanks to everyone for your introductory remarks. So I have a few questions to start us off with. So this is kind of a two-parter. Take whatever part you want. So the question is, will carbon credits accelerate the energy transition or extend our usage of fossil fuels? And a semi-follow-up to that is, are we creating perverse incentives with a carbon credit market applied to oil and gas wells? Open to anyone who wants to start.
Yeah, so the concept here is that if you allow operators to continue externalizing the cost of cleanup, then that gives them more capital to drill more wells faster than they were before. And so that's kind of the big question, right? Like, is there a way for these voluntary carbon credits to not do that, especially if it's a voluntary market that not everybody has to participate in? And is there anything in this agreement for the carbon credit that prevents the industry as a whole from accelerating the amount of development and production?
So before anyone else goes, I'll add a bit of nuance, which is that you really have to think about it differently in the case of orphan wells, where there's a responsible party, or where there's not a responsible party, and these other types of wells where there are. And then even among idle wells, marginal wells, and fully active wells, there's also a different set of considerations. But anyway, I'll shut up and give it back to the panel.
No, I actually agree with you, Adam. I think that's an extremely important distinction. I think one of the things that's been lacking in this entire symposium is that we started with the premise of the solution, which was carbon markets, and we never fully articulated what the problem was. What is the question, the answer to which is voluntary carbon markets? It's unclear to me what that is. There could be several. I think I heard collections of three sort of classes of problems that people identified. One was reducing emissions from orphaned wells. There's no clear owner. We need to prioritize plugging these wells, and carbon markets is one way to help prioritize the plugging of that with a limited budget. Fine. There are other mechanisms of doing that as well, but that's one clear problem. The other question was, how do we leave the oil in the ground? A whole series of questions around that. And could carbon markets be used to leave the oil in the ground, to create incentives for people to shut in wells early, essentially, right? And the third set of questions, which was never articulated explicitly, but was implicit in many, many, many of these presentations today, was existing regulations isn't working. We need to replace it with something else. I am very wary of that third class of questions, because carbon markets, although they're outside the normal regulatory process, where that's the way they're being implemented right now, are fundamentally a regulatory mechanism, policy mechanism. There are usually policy mechanisms in place to address the other two concerns, and they aren't working. If the problem then is that regulation is not working, it seems very strange to me to add an additional regulatory mechanism to compensate for that.
I would piggyback on David's comment and say, offer a bit of direct experience, and as well try to collapse the binary between carbon markets and direct regulation. Onyx is at present working with regulated or regulatory bodies in order to enable more comprehensive regulation, when the mechanism was actually designed for application and still applies to voluntary carbon markets. And I fully support your statement as well, David, that, I said, policy has failed, and I think, you know, writ large, it has. That doesn't mean we abandon efforts towards, you know, increasingly rigorous policy, but there are thorny challenges to passing that policy that we've seen time and time again. So in my mind, it's absolutely a yes and I would simply add that I think, again, to the point of the transition, I think carbon credits and carbon finance have the potential to accelerate the transition when designed and used very thoughtfully. Of course, considerations like additionality and quantification are paramount importance, but we really have to ask, you know, does an intervention that generates a credit, does the intervention reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are consumed or the associated emissions with bringing them to market? And if so, you know, then I think it's a very worthwhile credit to explore. I'm of the opinion that there are some things that are more easily dealt with by just direct regulation, like fugitive emissions from the oil industry. They reduce emissions, but do they explicitly promote a transition? That's a question that is at the top of my mind, is how to accelerate the transition. And I think also one last comment there, in terms of mitigating perverse incentives, it really is critical to build into the system the notion of the use of proceeds. There have got to be guardrails and mechanisms in place for constraining the flow of capital directly back to the, you know, bad actor. Without those guardrails in place or mechanisms in place, then there's no guarantee that funds from a credit transaction aren't just redeployed to expanding oil production. Yeah.
Any other thoughts along these lines?
I gotta hop in just to thank you, Adam, for really making that clarification around orphaned wells and the differentiation, because having no responsible party makes a big difference. And in some ways that ship has sailed. And if regulation came down in place to prevent any more wells from being orphaned, we would still have plenty of orphan wells to keep us busy for a very long time with nowhere near the financing needed. And that's why ACR focused and chose that focus specifically. We had in our original drafts of the methodology looked at doing what we were calling abandoned wells, but wells that were, you know, low producers with operators, and ultimately decided that the additionality was going to be really hard to demonstrate across jurisdictions. And so that's why we chose to focus just on these orphaned wells. And I know, Adam, you know very, very much that the problem is bigger than we know. And, you know, sort of anecdotally, I'm hearing for every orphaned well that is on an orphaned well list, there's probably 5 to 10 effectively orphaned wells that are not on the list, whether they're just unknown wells or they're wells that don't really have an operator, but they haven't been officially added to the list yet. So the body of work for plugging orphaned wells is huge. And because there's just no one to hold accountable, that was the purpose of our focus there, and why we were comfortable with doing that.
Maris, I want to pick up on that for a sec and just note that thinking about the orphan well closure in the United States, which is at top of mind for many, there's around 120,000 documented orphan wells in the US, and you alluded to this population of undocumented orphan wells, which I've seen estimated at 800,000, 1 million, some say 2 or 3 million. And that is pretty daunting, given that the federal funds made available to close these wells, $4.7 billion, is, according to the states, only half the amount needed for the documented orphan well population of 120,000 wells. And it doesn't begin to get at this undocumented orphan well population. So I've been thinking a lot about what's the intersection of the federal funding that's pouring into closing wells, even though it's not enough, but is oriented around the highest emitting wells, and the emerging carbon market that's also oriented around the highest emitting wells. Are they competing? How do we think about that?
Great question. And I would just say, I don't see that it really is prioritized. The federal program really is prioritizing the high emitting wells. And the metric there, they didn't ask about emissions, they asked about jobs, and they asked about well counts. And those are important numbers, right? But we're actually requiring measurements and going out and physically standing at a well site with some form of meter to get the flow out of that well, not just concentration, but actual flow coming out of the well. And that's above and beyond, well above and beyond. And so again, it gives that separate metric to wells that may be easier to plug, you know, shallower or just accessible. Some of these wells are in locations that will require roads to be built and all kinds of other considerations. And some of these wells are near sensitive receptors in communities that have already been plenty impacted by these industries. And so not advocating just for methane to be the only key piece that we're looking at, but being really intentional about how we spend those limited funds and hopefully adding more funds to that pool. So instead of saying, hey, yay, we plugged 50 wells, saying, hey, we plugged 20 wells. But this is, you know, the environmental benefits, and these are the co-benefits of those wells specifically being plugged. That's our focus.
And I'll just note before I pass it along to others that the Department of Interior in the guidance for the next tranche of funding that's coming out, the $2 billion central fund, is requiring states to quantify emissions from all wells with a methane show, and are strongly encouraging states to consider prioritizing those wells first. But they're also saying, please also prioritize emissions that are in environmental justice areas, that are close to where people live, that are close to sensitive ecosystem receptors. And so it's kind of pulling it in a lot of different directions.
It's evolving. Yeah.
Yes. Anyone?
I just want to say I have one response to what you were saying, Maris, about like there's no responsible party out there for these orphaned wells. And that's not really true in all cases. I think part of the problem is that not most, but some states don't allow you to go back to prior operators to recover funds, right? And so like the fundamental problem that we have in Texas is that when you transfer a well to a new operator, you fully transfer liability and you can't go back to that prior operator to recover funds for plugging a well. And so if we solved that policy problem, we might not even have as big of a pool of orphan wells with no money to plug.
Agree. Yes, that's a good lever to pull. I would say that's a really good lever to pull, and I know states are looking. I live in California, and we just passed legislation similar. So again, still leaving lots of wells to work on. Sorry, David.
No. I was gonna thank Virginia for throwing that out, and also you, Maris, for pointing out all the data that's being collected. The data, I mean, look, I was formerly at the USEIA, and I gotta tell you that I firmly believe that data, you know, more information is always good. It will eventually get into regulation. It will eventually get used by the feds. It will not happen nearly as fast as you want it to happen, but it will eventually get there. Feds aren't stupid. They will eventually pick up on these new data sources and say, you know, we should incorporate that stuff, and they'll get it in eventually. But it sounds like, you know, Virginia, you pointed out a really clear issue, you know, which is the ownership of these wells. And with that very clear identification of an issue, there are lots of policy solutions that you can come up with, right? I mean, Brad Handler, I think in the chat, mentioned, you know, bonding, which is another solution to that same problem, right? There are many solutions we can come up with, and then we can have this wonderful argument over beers, preferably, about which solutions are the best and the most efficient solutions to those particular problems. But we have to have an identified problem. And right now I see with the carbon markets, we have a solution without an identifiable problem. The solution itself is a market-based solution. And in general, market-based solutions, if you talk to economists, will tell you there's two reasons you want to use them. One in which the command and control policies are less efficient. Market-based solutions tend to be more efficient. So, you know, economy-wide carbon prices, those kinds of things. And the other one in which you don't know the right technologies to solve the problem. And you don't want to pick technologies. You don't want to pick winners and losers. So you just set up a market to help the market decide. Those tend to be the two reasons you'd use market-based solutions. I don't see either one of those conditions holding here. We're holding for a problem that has been identified. And I keep searching for that. What's the problem for which one of those two conditions holds? And therefore, this market-based solution is the preferred answer. I don't see it.
I'll give you.
Caitlin.
Caitlin does.
Yeah,
Good.
I'll answer that question directly. But before I do, I wanted to piggyback on Virginia's comment about end of life liability associated with the well. If you think an individual well carries a big liability, let me introduce you to the nightmare of the end of life liability of an entire oil field. And what happens at the end of life of an oil field is there is a perverse incentive to continue operating as long as possible, even in the absence of profitability, in order to defer the end of life abandonment liability, which is potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, to fully, deinstall all the infrastructure, restore the land to code, et cetera. And what happens is that liability ends up getting punted down the line and then punted to the taxpayer. And there is now a very interesting report that was published by Carbon Tracker, looking at the end of life liability associated with oil production in the state of California, and came to the astonishing conclusion that the fourth largest economy in the world would be bankrupt if it takes on the associated end of life liability with its production, which is often what happens. So to your and it's a horrifying circumstance. David, to your point about what problem is being solved. There is a problem right now that is, threatening the potential of a civil war between the province of Alberta, which supplies 12% of a nation's GDP, pays for kids' lunch programs and preschools, and a desire by the federal government to curb the emissions associated with Albertan oil and gas production. It is a deadlock. The country wants to be in line with its Paris Agreement. The administration has, hung themselves, the current administration, on achieving that goal. And yet there's significant loss of significant economic value to huge populations, with big implications for just sweeping regulation that don't provide an incentive and a preservation of economic value. Do I like that circumstance? No, but it's our reality. So in this case, a carbon incentive creates a carrot. And I could, tell you all manner of reasons why I think it's a critically important tool in this application. But I'm sure there are others.
So Caitlin, is Alberta also requiring a cap on overall emissions while at the same time pursuing an interest in the carbon market?
Alberta, of course, is pushing back on any kind of cap. The Fed.
So then they would keep producing oil and expanding oil production business as usual if they had a carbon market or carbon credits for plugging?
The notion is that they, in the absence of a tool with which they can themselves choose to decommission assets in order to comply with a cap, they will continue producing, period. Or do what they're saying they will do, which is punt the reductions down the line 10, 20 years out when CCUS is, at some kind of cost parity, or invest in small modular nuclear reactors, which of course is, its own issue. That's the position. This can't be achieved now. These kinds of reductions cannot be achieved now. So in the absence of a crediting mechanism that helps them decommission assets, again, voluntarily within a compliance framework, they won't do it.
So this is interesting, actually. So the civil war that Caitlin's pointing out, it's a very polite civil war, by the way. It's Canada after all. So, it's been going on for decades. It's been going on for decades. And but the way you described it is not unfair. Very high stakes and very different points of view there. But so you're illustrating a regulatory failure, and your solution, or I think the solution that you're advocating, is a market-based outside sort of extra regulatory mechanism, which acts like a regulation on top of existing regulation. Virginia's solution to a similar problem in Texas is to lobby the regulator to change the regulations. I'm not saying that one is right or wrong, but those seem to be the two different solutions to that particular problem. If you have regulatory failure, then you fix the regulation, or you layer something else outside the regulatory process. I personally am very wary of the second because I have tried to model layered regulations. We call it additionality, but additionality sounds very clean and neat. It's usually very ugly, and I call them layered and kind of incoherent with each other. At EIA, I was the chief energy modeler, so we had to model every regulation in the country, federal laws, state laws, local laws as best we could, where they impacted the energy system. And we often found just perverse consequences from these things that were not additive in any way. Very often we run the model, we look at the outputs and we say, that's just wrong. We made a mistake somewhere. We go back and look for the bug, look, and we couldn't find it. And then we realized, oh, this is one of these perverse, leakages out of, regulatory leakages that's causing, really bizarre things to happen. I'll give you one example. We implemented California's ZEV program, right, for the first time, several years ago. It's now by default standard in the model. Believe it's all going to happen. They sell a lot of zero emission vehicles. But when we first implemented it for the first time, we sold a pile of EVs in the model, but our gasoline consumption in the country went up. And we thought, well, that's weird. Come on, what's going on there? And it turned out it was just regulatory leakage. So all the ZEVs got sold in the ZEV states, which is 40% of the market. The rest of the market didn't have to sell EVs, but they had to comply with the national CAFE standards. See, overlapping regulations. At the national level, they could comply much easier if they were selling ZEVs in the ZEV states. So that allowed them to sell a whole lot more gas guzzling SUVs and pickup trucks. And guess where they were selling them? Big sky country where they drove more kilometers. So less efficient vehicles driving more kilometers ended up selling more gasoline in the country. So it's those kinds of perverse incentives that I get terrified about when people start talking about additionality. These are really, really hard to model. You can't do it at the well level. You can't do it. The action is we're trying to incent action at the well level, right? That's one geography. We heard from Dwayne, I think, right, that the physical phenomena is happening at the basin, or at least at the play level, at the reservoir level, right? So we make an action at the well level, we shut in a well, we affect all the wells in the play. And yet the economic effects are happening at the company level and at the national level, national economy, which you heard from Brian, I think, where I talked about supply and demand curves. And then I think, Caitlin, you brought up the scary specter of taking the money that we've taken away and giving it back to the suppliers. So not only are we shifting the supply curve and then we have leakage again, now we're shifting the supply curve down because we're supplementing the supplier. I mean, there's really, very hard to model these things, very perverse outcomes that come out of these things. And then the problem we're ultimately trying to solve with this thing is reducing emissions, which is a global problem. So modeling all of the effects at the well level, the play level, at the national level, at the global level is really, really hard for this kind of a solution.
So what I've been thinking about as we've been discussing this is clearly there's some conflict between the policy reform route to get where we want to go and the voluntary carbon market route to get to where we want to go. To what extent are they in true conflict with each other? How much does the existence of voluntary carbon market mechanisms to deal with problems that we have not yet been able to deal with in policy actually put off the policy solution? How do we think about that?
So I don't think they're in conflict. I would say that they're different tools in parallel, and politically getting things passed and getting things through is really challenging. And I think probably everyone on the panel has some experience with that. And I lead our tech-based team at ACR, so basically everything that's not a tree. And within that, for things like ozone depleting substances or mine methane or landfill gas, all of these things I would love to see as policy. I would love to see that these methodologies get retired because they are no longer additional. That has become business as usual for oil and gas companies to be held accountable to plugging their wells. That's a big lift, and that's a big lift across a lot of sectors. And I know we're focused on wells, and I'm focused specifically on orphaned wells within this discussion, but in that gap there, we can be doing both. And not everybody is going to be working on both at all times. But ACR's role, and what we see as our role in this, is to provide that sort of gap funding, and that we're incentivizing early action. And if someone thinks down the line and these things do become a requirement, we're encouraging those people who got out ahead of it.
Let me make a proposal. I think that plugging the orphan wells problem, which is large and doesn't have a clear owner, would be a fantastic test case for voluntary carbon markets. It acts on a set of operators that would not be threatened by the markets, not necessarily the oil and gas players. It's a really interesting test case. If everything goes to pot and goes terribly wrong with the markets, we're still going to plug some wells. It's okay. You know, the worst case scenario isn't that bad.
Well, I mean, I can see this being used as an excuse by the Railroad Commission to not change their rules at all, because then they'll be more worried about the jobs created by the carbon market and, you know, the economy created by the carbon market and preserving that, instead of spending, you know, instead of increasing fees or surcharges or increasing bonds for the operators, which would be, you know, a logical solution to the problem. So yeah, I mean, I do still see it as a perverse incentive when it comes to orphaned wells and when it comes to inactive wells that have an active operator. And I'm not sure I'm convinced by the marginal well argument yet. And I think it's because of this question of slippage and leakage, right? I don't think that there's a real solution to that yet with a voluntary carbon market that lacks an overall carbon tonnage cap.
And I hear that, and I would just say,
Oh, what a moment to lose connectivity.
What a fantastic dramatic pause. I am still waiting.
oh no, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Am I back?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Back.
Okay, sorry. Dramatic pause, yes. So just the number of wells out there that are going to be able to be plugged wholly by the voluntary carbon market is very, very limited, and like very limited. And so this specific methodology where we drew our guardrails at ACR is not going to fund an entire orphan well plugging program within any jurisdiction. It's very limited. And what we're hoping to do with this methodology is, again, focus on those big emitters, and with the focus on that the methane piece. And so if the state is looking to sort of utilize this to move in the direction of it being a perverse incentive, it's going to not be successful ultimately in getting wells plugged.
So thinking about the proliferation of methodologies that are out there for these different types of wells and different phases of their life cycle, what are the best ways to ensure safeguards for the credits that are being sold? And how do we think about bad actors who are trying to turn a quick buck on this?
We heard some of that earlier around like the ICVCM and some of the other initiatives that are out there. And, you know, the carbon markets in general, I joined 2.5 years ago, and just the demand for accountability and transparency has really skyrocketed in that 2.5 years. And in each methodology, we heard about, you know, mine methane, and we heard about REDD+. Each methodology and each type of credit really needs to be treated individually. And the demands on the carbon market right now are big. Lots of expansion, increasing transparency and accountability, and just more credits and more types of credits, having more of a menu for buyers to choose from. So lots going on. Stay tuned for how all these things continue to shape up. But I certainly lean hard into all of these oversight groups, because I think ultimately that transparency is answering questions that need to be asked, and the carbon markets themselves, because we're dealing with this sort of environmental attribute, this 1 ton of carbon, there's not something that's quite comparable across, you know, other markets and financial markets that are out there. And so it really sort of deserves its own look and deserves its own solution.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that. You know, when we set out to create a methodology for shutting in economic, actively producing oil fields and to open the permission space for doing that, you know, we knew we were entering a very fraught space, and that in terms of methodological rigor, we needed to bring to market something that delivered in terms of rigor and quality, a 12 on a scale of 1 to 10. So we set out to build a network of experts in the space, including some who have spoken today in various seminars, nonprofits, and stakeholders, and to take real time to work through exceptionally thorny, complex issues. I can offer you some of the safeguards we've built into, you know, our platform. And we also knew at the time, you know, that the incumbent standards may not be, including one I helped start, up to snuff for this activity, that we would have to be prepared to go it alone, and hopefully work with them, you know, but that we were pushing the envelope and a frontier. And, you know, it requires very specific, industry-specific expertise as well. I can offer safeguards that we've built in. You know, I think we've seen the importance of dynamic baselines, rigorous treatment of leakage, and post hoc, you know, ex ante analysis in the forestry space. But in terms of oil crediting, you know, there and predicting a future, there is always some margin of uncertainty. You know, production volumes are a proxy for emissions. You know, you're always looking at a fluctuating price on both oil and carbon to determine additionality. So you need regular look backs to ensure that each project is living up to its intent. I don't know if you want me to go into more detail. There is a lot more detail, but I think the big issues are patience, network of expertise, and nonprofit involvement at the very outset, you know, before we get into much more complicated technical issues, which I'm happy to.
Can I ask a question, Adam? Am I allowed to do that, or is that only?
Yes.
I know
Yes.
it's your job, but
This is a conversation in its best form. This is a conversation.
fantastic. But I can only ask the question by leading into it with my fears. I'll tell you my nightmare fears as a modeler, right? As a modeler at EIA, we weren't modeling carbon. Well, we were fitting wells because we had to model the oil and gas supply in the U.S. So we fit, you know, at the time there was 400,000 wells. We fit all of them to the decline curves. I fit a few thousand of them myself by hand, and then we had the experts that would correct my fits and say, no, that was all wrong. They showed me why I was wrong, but that's fine. I learned a ton. So I'm familiar with the general concept of taking a baseline of action or baseline of no action, and you compare it to a baseline of action. You compare the two, do a delta analysis, and that is the impact of the action. That can be done over and over and over again, and I think most of the methodologies we're talking about here for carbon accounting do versions of that. If we don't do any action, we have a well that continues to emit. What happens? Okay, good. If we take action, we plug a well, then what happens? And we compare the two things. The problem, and the reason that's okay to do, even in a model where you know that you're going to be wrong about the future, there's all kinds of huge uncertainties, is because you assume that the action you take is one, small, and two, limited in scope, so that all those uncertainties you have in the baseline of no action cancel out when you do the delta of the baseline with action. There are a lot of uncertainties, but they're all highly correlated. The covariance matrix is almost identical in the two cases, right? In this case, that's not quite true. We take action at the well level, And if we didn't take any action, especially on a well that's still producing, we don't actually know what would happen to that well. We don't know what the operator decisions would be on that well in the future. We have to make that up. There is no action. There's always an operator in there that could always take action. So there's some optionality involved. We can make assumptions, sure, but we don't really know what's going to happen with the well itself. If we take action and plug the well in, now we don't know what happens with the rest of the system. We don't know how the rest of the system will respond to shutting that well in. So we have uncertainty in both, but the uncertainties are different types of uncertainties. One's on the well, one's on everything but the well. When we take the delta, we can't be sure that those uncertainties collapse. That's the way I characterize the uncertainty problem to myself, but there were other people in the second or third session, I think, that characterized it much better than I did. They did a very compelling job of explaining exactly how much uncertainty there is in these things, which was great, it was phenomenal. Those were scientists. I love scientists. They love uncertainty. They wallow in it, and I'm from my DNA is there, right? But if you're talking about markets, you need what they call transparency. When they say transparency, what they really mean is determinism. They need to know precisely what product they are buying and selling. It's a pork belly. There is no ambiguity about what that is. You can count them. They're countable things. 1, 2, 3 of them. All the uncertainty gets piled into the price of the product, but the product itself is extremely certain. We know precisely what that product is, and this is true for every market: stock markets, commodity markets, oil markets, electricity markets. They all define the products very, very carefully. Here, we're talking about a carbon credit where the very definition of the thing has uncertainty. So the question is, to the experts that have thought about this a lot more than I have, how do you reconcile the fundamental scientific uncertainty in what a carbon credit represents with the need for deterministic certainty by a financial market? I don't know the answer. This isn't like a trap. That's why I'm asking the people that know.
I'm trying to decide if I'm brave enough to wade into that one. You point at a fantastic question, that has been inherent in carbon market counterfactual logic since the conception of carbon markets. I would argue that for certain activities, you can remove and collapse much more of that uncertainty than you can others, which is precisely why, again, I'm speaking from my experience, we chose to go at a lexicon, a legacy lexicon in the carbon market for how to categorize this type of credit. This is neither an avoidance credit that assumes replacement of one activity with another type of activity. This is not a removal credit that, removes an amount of carbon from the atmosphere by virtue of a nature-based or a technology-based solution in the future, sometime in the future. This is based in science, based in very quantifiable by virtue of the extent to which oil and gas facilities are rigorously quantified, studied, accounted, audited, one of the most data-rich industries in the world, in which we leverage that data and say, we can tell you with much more certainty that a ton of carbon has been permanently eliminated from circulation. Again, I'm happy to get into much more technical details. It's maybe not appropriate here, but I guess I ask you, what better tools do we have, David?
David,
I'm not
before
selling
you answer that question, I'm going to note that we have 4 minutes. And so I want to bring us to a practical question that I think will actually continue the dialogue that we were just having. And that is, there are policymakers on the line. There are state legislators, there are state regulators, there are national regulators, and they are thinking about how to deal with this emerging world of carbon finance in the well closure space. Right now, the Department of Interior, for example, has declined to allow mixing of the federal funds for well closure with carbon finance. The Oklahoma legislature has passed laws facilitating the use of carbon finance in well closure. And a lot of states are wondering, is this right for us? We've had so many of these wells, they're not getting plugged, we're desperate for money. What should we do? How to advise those people who are making these decisions?
So I would steal from Caitlin earlier, saying yes, yes, and we do like it down in the weeds, but ultimately we need all of this, and we need all of it really, really quickly. And so if there's parallel programs going on, that's great. Having a robust carbon market is not going to be a viable excuse for not looking for really big policy changes broadly. And very delighted to say that strongly at a carbon market where our bread and butter is generating carbon credits. We've got plenty to do, and we really would love to work in parallel with policy changes, because the lift is enormous, and you know what we're putting together is something that we believe is defensible, and it doesn't address, you know, every issue in every well. And when we often use, and I often use the analogy of a toolbox, and you know that the carbon markets are one tool in the toolbox, and they're not right for every job. They're not going to fix everything. We're trying to remodel like a house here, and the carbon markets are maybe a screwdriver. That's only going to get us so far. It's essential, it's going to help, but we're going to need some like crowbars to dismantle things. We're going to need some hammers to really put things in place. So it's a yes and an all of the above.
Great. And any final comments? 20 seconds.
I would add to thank you for that, Maris, and just say there is absolutely a precedent as well for voluntary activity becoming pre-compliance activity, becoming regulated compliance activity. You know, that precedent has been established over the last 2 decades. There is a way that carbon markets can be, voluntary activity can kickstart activities that are then adopted by regulators. So absolutely a yes and a way to parallel path.
Great. Well, since we're out of time for much more conversation, I'm just going to call it, because we covered a lot of ground. I think there's a lot of nuance here that we're beginning to explore. I don't think we gave that many easy answers for exactly what all these policymakers should do, but we certainly told them what they need to be thinking about in order to think about this intelligently. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Rebecca to close it out. And again, say thank you so much to the panel for this great conversation.
Thanks.
Yes, and I will echo that gratitude to this set of panelists, all the panelists, and the moderators for sharing their expertise and thoughts on this complex set of issues. And also thank you to all of the attendees for your questions, comments, ideas. It's been an interesting and long conversation, so I know it's a long time to sit virtually, but we really appreciate everyone being here. We have created a short survey to hear from you about your thoughts on today's symposium. So please take a few minutes to share what you thought of this, what you've learned. We read every single response and work to address your feedback. So we really appreciate you taking the time. To wrap up, I think clearly we've learned that there's a lot to consider with carbon credits, financing, the voluntary carbon market, and the oil and gas sector. I've learned a lot from today's speakers, and I hope that you all have learned something and that you'll share what you've learned with your colleagues. Obviously, I can't summarize all that we've discussed over these last 4 hours, but I think a few key points that I heard is that in the absence of regulations, science-based methodologies and transparency in the voluntary carbon market are key in this sector as well as in other sectors. As we heard from our experts in multiple sessions, the science and the ability to track and measure emissions continues to advance rapidly, and that's key to our understanding of what these carbon credits mean. With these advances, there will be better estimates throughout the oil and gas sector, and this may provide more information and reduce the range and variability in these emissions that we currently see in the data and some of the questions that we have about these emissions. This is an important piece of the scientific evidence that we need to meet the criteria for generating high quality carbon credits. And we've heard today from many experts that accurate emission measurements, credit quality, and transparency within the voluntary carbon markets are crucial components, and that these can impact trust in the market. And we've seen that that trust can be eroded from the nature-based solutions carbon market. And so a key part of participation and success of voluntary carbon markets is trust. And science, scientific evidence, and transparent methodologies and verification are likely to help with that trust as people advance their thinking and planning around this carbon financing. With that, I will say again, thank you to all of you who have stuck around and asked your questions and shared your ideas. And we will end 2 minutes early. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.